Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to the third event in our series about well-being during and hopefully post the pandemic shortly. Today, we've got a fantastic session titled Why Measuring Wellbeing Makes Business Sense. Personally, I'm really excited to hear what our speakers have to say. I've been measuring wellbeing in virtually every research study I've been doing over the past few years. So I want to learn as much about this kind of thing as possible. We've got two fantastic speakers today. We have Professor Sara Connolly of University of East Anglia and Martin Short of the MOD. So without further ado from me, I'll hand over to, I think, Martin first, who'll kick off the presentation today.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much for attending this third in the sort of series of events. So what we're going to do today is a little bit of a sort of double act with me and Sarah. So me looking at it from an employer's perspective, and Sarah, doing a little bit of exploration around the academic side. So I think COVID has given all of us, a lot of sort of pause for thought to think about well-being, our lives, both domestic and our working lives as well. And if the wellbeing marketplace was a busy environment before COVID, it's an even busier one now. And so from an employer's perspective, it's actually quite challenging to sort of identify the wellbeing needs of your organization, but also actually select interventions which are going to address those needs and that that actually work. And so, of course, that's where measuring well-being has benefits. If you actually know the impact, if you actually understand what your well-being challenges are, if you actually make interventions and then measure the effectiveness of those interventions, you get better reassurance that those finite resources that you've actually got to spend on well-being are actually having the impact that you want them to have. I'm not going to run through, the full details of the sort of post-COVID environment, but what I would like to do is perhaps before sort of Sarah starts is actually look at some of the basics around well-being. I often find that well-being, it can be quite a fluffy term, and unless you actually define what you're talking about early in conversations, it's very easy to end up talking at cross purposes. So I think when we talk about, what we mean by well-being, for many of us, well-being still has rather a fluffy image, and there's lots of reasons behind this. There's dated attitudes to mental health in some organizations. There's a lack of awareness about the link between well-being and better business outcomes. And you've also got a well-being industry that makes some fairly bold promises about, what their workplace interventions can do. But these don't always deliver. And when employers are reluctant to evaluate those interventions, it makes it even harder to actually understand what works and what doesn't work. We also have a tendency to over-medicalize well-being, which is quite unfortunate because, research, and what I'm showing here is from the Mental Health Foundation, it indicates that only about 1/10 of the population's well-being is actually linked to healthcare. It's things like the quality of our work, it's the surroundings that we have, and many of us have had the opportunity to reflect, say, just how important a little garden is throughout the COVID sort of period, because it's provided us with that little bit of green breathing space that we've all appreciated. It's things like the quality of our commutes. We did some research back in 2018, which indicated that 80% of our London staff was stressed by the time they even arrived at work in the morning because of the ordeal of having to, make their way into London. It's things like access to money and resources. It's the quality of our housing. And most importantly of all, and an issue that's often overlooked, is the quality of our relationships with our family, with our friends, with our colleagues, and with our communities. And as social animals, those positive relationships are really important to us. So the What Works Centre for Wellbeing did some research about 5 years back now, which really regards wellbeing itself as being an outcome. So, we tend to feel the way that we do about our lives because of our individual outlook on life, the genes that we inherit from our parents, but also because stuff happens to us in our lives to make us feel the way that we do as we move across the life course. And so I think it's probably worth just pausing for a moment, just to sort of reflect, if you're listening into this sort of session, on what are the top 3 important things that are important to you in your life. You might be thinking about family, you might be thinking about money, you might be thinking about health or achievement or being motivated or inspired by what you do. Perhaps it's something about having fun or being valued or respected for who you are. And there's no real right or wrong answer with this, because we're all different and we're all driven by a range of motivations. And these can change as we go through life. So the things that matter to us as young men and women may be very different to, the things that matter to us later in life. And naturally, our priorities shift. So, what matters as a young single person may be very different to someone with caring responsibilities in middle or old age. But it is important to remember that we all make that same journey across the life course. We share that same path, and we make those same sometimes difficult transitions from our teenage years to being adults, from being in work to retiring. And throughout that life course, we have to deal with those inevitable and sometimes unpredictable life events that influence that journey. So about 5 years ago, as I said, the What Works Centre for Wellbeing did a big public consultation exercise in the UK, and it simply asked people, to list the things that they felt were important in their life. And this slide summarises, what that analysis actually found. So broadly speaking, the responses sort of focused down onto sort of 3 areas: that need to feel safe, really in terms of being financially comfortable, having good physical and mental health, access to good food, job, housing and transport. But also there was something around the need to feel loved in its broadest sense, being respected and appreciated for who you are, having those positive social connections, being appreciated for who you are, and feeling as if you're part of something bigger. And then finally, there was a cluster around this need to sort of feel fulfilled. So having that sense of achievement, being inspired by what you do, feeling valued, having those opportunities for fun, learning, actually sort of being in control of the decisions in your life that influenced the direction that it took. So that sense that it was you operating the levers, those decisions that really mattered. So well-being itself is, as we sort of treat it, certainly within our organisation, is a very, very broad concept. And I think it's worth, perhaps re-looking at some of the benefits that you actually get by sort of investing in well-being in workplaces. So, while the benefits of feeling safe, loved and fulfilled are probably pretty obvious to us all as individuals, there's also a much bigger picture here, as people with higher levels of well-being tend to enjoy better health. They enjoy their work more and contribute to it more. They're often more productive and more creative. And when they're happier in their personal lives, they also make an enhanced contribution to the communities in which they live, be they at work or in their neighbourhoods where they live. And across all of these domains, what the research, by the What Works Centre has sort of found out, that there are some cross-cutting issues that go across all these domains. So this importance of positive social connections in workplaces and in our family lives, that sense of personal control, that, we have choices and we are empowered to make the decisions that matter to us in our lives. And, it may sound very glib, but certainly in workplace, kindness is one of the most powerful tools that we've actually got. And when someone is struggling with well-being or mental health, then 10 minutes time spent listening and perhaps showing a little bit of empathy and compassion can make an enormous difference, and in some cases can make the difference between someone staying in work and going off on sickness absence for 6 months. So there are, a whole range of benefits that, you can actually get from treating wellbeing seriously in organisations. And what we're going to do over the next sort of 20 minutes or so is explore. So I'm going to hand over to Sara now, who will actually sort of take you through the case for evaluation and some of, what the research in this area is saying at the moment. And then it'll pass back to me at the end, and we'll do just a very brief case study of how it's panned out in my organisation, Defence Intelligence. So, Sara, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Martin. So as Martin's already identified, COVID has really brought to the fore the importance of health and well-being in the workplace. But as an organisation, when you start to think about which interventions, for whom, when, there's a huge range of possible activities. So it might be exercise, it may be encouraging healthy eating, it might be discouraging unhealthy eating, and all of those might be important on the health side. And on the well-being, it might be a focus on mental health, resilience, mindfulness, volunteering, financial well-being, a whole range of different activities that you could implement within your organization. And so the case for evaluation is partly about working out what's going to make most business sense for you at any moment in time. And what I'm going to do is to talk through some general principles first, and then to illustrate how you might undertake an evaluation. So, Martin, if we move on to the next slide, please. And if you could press click again, it turns out it's building up. Sorry about that, Martin. I'm going to keep you busy. So the case for evaluation is about assessing all of the possible costs associated with an intervention. And I think it's really important to build in the full range of costs, from the initial design and planning, the delivery of an intervention, how much time it takes for your workforce to participate in the intervention, and any other actual costs. Maybe it's hiring a trainer, maybe it's a venue for the activity. But also, crucially, once the intervention has been implemented, to monitor any of the productivity savings that Martin's already alluded to. We may see reductions in sickness absence. We may see improved employee engagement. And all of these, maybe reduced staff turnover, all of these will yield productivity savings. And so those are all important on the cost side. And what an evaluation might do is to put a pound value to those costs. Martin, another click, please. But the benefit that we must always keep in mind is the well-being gains from an intervention of this sort. And Martin's talked about the importance of measuring well-being. And if we follow the sort of advice from What Works Centre for Wellbeing, that might be through capturing life satisfaction or job satisfaction within an organization. So an evaluation would take account of these full costs and these longer term benefits. And how do you make a comparison between pounds and well-being? So Martin, another click, please. Well, this approach, a cost effectiveness approach, isn't new, but it is new to apply it in the case of well-being. This approach of comparing a cost against the intention of an intervention has been used widely in the field of health, where health interventions are assessed about the quality of adjusted life years and the cost of the intervention. And the government currently uses a threshold of £25,000 for each extra quality adjusted life year. And so the team at What Works Centre for Wellbeing, led by Richard Layard, have adjusted the approach in the case of wellbeing to take an adjustment, which is that one extra life satisfaction unit is worth spending £2,500. And so that's the threshold that we're going to use in this evaluation. Next slide, please. Thank you. And this work that Martin, Kevin Daniels and I have been working on alongside the What Works Centre for Wellbeing provides a range of useful tools in terms of general principles, context, what works, and the tool that I'm going to particularly focus on, the cost effectiveness calculator. And Marion, thank you very much, has just posted the link to this website in the chat. Martin, next slide, please. And so this cost effectiveness calculator is a step-by-step guide to how you might monitor the impact of your interventions. It gives you a guidance on how to identify all of the different costs, how to think about the different productivity benefits, but also how to convert the measures that you're using within your organization to capture well-being into life satisfaction, which is the core measure that we're going to be using. And it gives you a sense of how long these effects will last, and with what confidence you can draw conclusions based on the intervention. Martin, next slide, please. And although this looks as though I'm about to do some highly complicated maths, I'm just actually going to give you a sense of what would be cost effective and what would not be cost effective. So that line going across adds together all of the points that are absolutely at that threshold of £2,500 per unit of life satisfaction. Anything below that line is cost effective. And Martin, the next slide, please. And the area that we really want to be aiming to get into is that lower right-hand quadrant, where not only does this intervention achieve cost effectiveness in as much as it costs us less than £2,500 to deliver an extra unit of life satisfaction, this is the area where actually the organization is able to benefit from savings. It actually saves you money and boosts well-being within your organization. Martin, next slide, please. Now I'm going to talk about several areas of research to illustrate this. And the first is going to be some research that we did with the College of Policing, a randomized control trial of mindfulness across 5 police forces in England and Wales. And this was a randomized control trial of mindfulness training. And there were actually 2 types of mindfulness training that were made available to police officers and staff. One was a generic mindfulness app that probably many of us have on our phones, Headspace, and the other was an industrial-specific mindfulness app designed specifically for police work, police officers and staff in mind. And so there were 2 trial groups for the 2 different mindfulness apps, and a control group, a very large control group that was sustained over a 6-month period. Martin, if you could press for the next slide, please. So just to summarize what happened over this time period, the costs for MindFit COP were quite significant because the app had to be designed, it had to be implemented and made usable over the web. Headspace was available commercially, so it was license fees for that, and obviously no cost for the control group. Over that 6-month period, what we observed were fewer days of sickness absence for the 2 trial groups and more sickness absence for the control group. We also saw those that participated in the trial reporting improved productivity. So this was a self-reflection on their productivity. They were asked if they felt more productive, but actually these figures are absolutely consistent with the other evidence that they gave on presenteeism. The 2 trial groups also reported much fewer days of presenteeism, being at work and not working effectively. So entirely consistent. So we saw reduced sickness absence, improved productivity, and we also saw improved well-being. Now, you'll notice that it's not just that we saw improved well-being in the 2 app groups, we also saw improved well-being in the control group. And this is, of course, the great benefit of having a control. What we're able to see is what changed beyond what was happening within the organisation. What can we link with the intervention itself? So Martin, the next slide, please. And so taking this all through the calculator, what we're actually able to show is not only were both apps cost effective, actually they both made significant savings per person engaged in the intervention. Savings of £3,000 per person on the MindFit COP and £2,500 per person on the Headspace. So these apps not only improved well-being significantly, they also reduced costs for the police forces involved. Martin, next slide, please. So most organisations, I recognise, are not going to have the capacity or the opportunities to implement randomised control trials. Most organisations, at best, are going to be able to have measurements of the way things were before an intervention and the way things were afterwards, or they might run a pilot within their organisation. And so the next few slides are really going to be about some case studies that we've worked with, where organisations have implemented an initiative intended to improve well-being. And what I've done is or what the team have done, is to estimate the costs and to document the benefits. And these two on this side, these are cases where the organisations just had before and after measures. So that the first intervention is in the higher education environment. It was a very, very simple HR intervention introducing a flexible working system. So it didn't take a lot of time. It didn't take a lot of training. It was really just about developing a new protocol, making sure everybody was aware of it, and allowing people to work flexibly within certain core hours. And so it was relatively cheap, £6,800 to implement. And what did the team notice as a consequence? The main thing that they noticed was a reduction in staff sickness over the 6-month period. And they also noted improvements in staff feeling in control of their work. And so the net cost per employee was only £17.20, so well below that £2,500 threshold. So certainly cost effective. The second example that I want to talk about here is a much more ambitious program of implementing mental health first aiders within a local authority. Now, this is a much more significant investment. It's significant in terms of the cost of training, but also significant in terms of the time engaged in the training and in supporting and acting as a mental health first aid advocate within the organisation. So the cost we estimated here as £22,000, so very significant. What did the local authority notice as a consequence of this? Now, one of the things that they noticed, which is an adverse effect, is an increase in days off sick due to mental health. But they actually regarded this as evidence of success of the program, because this meant that people being properly directed for the support that was available within the organisation. Managers in the local authority felt a lot more reported feeling a lot more confident in supporting colleagues with mental health problems, and crucially, staff turnover within the organisation fell dramatically before in terms of what it was before and in what it was after. And actually, that reduction in staff turnover saved the local authority a significant amount of money, transferring that into a net cost per employee of just £2.46, but with huge benefits to the organisation, and again, well below the threshold of £2,500. Martin, the next slide, please. So the third case study that I want to talk about is even more ambitious. This is a much more costly intervention. This was in a construction company where the organisation piloted, and this is a very interesting difference from the previous two. This is a pilot, so what we're able to do is to compare before and after for the pilot group compared with the rest of the organisation. They piloted a new personalised wellbeing coaching plan. So this involved bringing in consultants. It involved one-to-one sessions for the pilot group, but it was associated with really significant benefits for the pilot group compared with other people within the same organisation. So this company saw a reduction in staff sickness, they saw a reduction in employee turnover, they saw an improvement in staff engagement in their regular pulse surveys of staff engagement. They also saw really significant reductions in poor health and improvements in good health outcomes. Now, the productivity benefits, the reductions in staff absenteeism and the reductions in staff turnover have led to really significant savings for this organisation. So this intervention in the end didn't cost the organisation per person. It saved £2,500 or £2,600 per person. And so that gives you an illustration of the ways in which you might think about evaluating different sorts of interventions. Thanks very much, Martin, for changing the slides. Thank you.
Martin, you're on mute.
Sorry, I hit the button twice there, Mike. So yeah, thanks, Sarah. So what I'm going to do over the next 5 minutes or so is just take a sort of very brief sort of follow on and just look at my organisation and the way that we've tried to sort of measure well-being within our organisation. So just to give you a little bit of a background about it. So Defence Intelligence is the intelligence organisation of the MOD. Essentially, it's about trying to help decision makers make better decisions on the best available evidence that is out there. So not a great deal of difference between, I think, what Sarah and Kevin are trying to do with their evidence program. We're just trying to help people make better decisions based on evidence. So there's about 4,000 people in the organisation. It's a mixture of RAF, Army, Navy, civilians, and it's about 65% military and 35% civilians, spread over a vast estate. Demographics are different at every single site. Wide range of wellbeing challenges, and each organisation has its own distinct microcultures, which are influenced by the nature of the leadership in that location, the nature of the workforce and its composition, the environment, and the mission they're actually involved in delivering it. So what we do, and what we have been doing since 2018, is actually try to take make a strong focus on measuring well-being in the organisation, and we do that longitudinally over time. So we used the What Works Centre for Wellbeing's full survey back in 2018, and we've recently repeated that, and the latest reports are actually now out on the impact that we've had in that 3-year period. What we also do is actually try and break it down by demographic grouping as well. So what we're able to do is actually see whether there are particular sort of groups that have significant wellbeing variation. So we look at gender, we look at ethnicity, we look at breaking down LGBT wellbeing into sexual orientation, age, disability, military, civilian, that sort of thing. We're starting to get some really, really interesting insights as a result of the volume of data that we're now starting to collect. So I think, just looking at this larger diagram here, this is a sort of summary of our findings from 2018. And you can see that, if you look down the sort of vertical axis there, they're the elements within the sort of What Works Centre for Wellbeing 5 drivers framework that we seek to measure. And across the horizontal axis, you can actually see different sites within our organisation. So you can see almost instantly that, you know, the wellbeing challenges that we have in our workplaces are different at every single site. In some, if you look at sites through to one to 4, you can actually see that the civilian experience can be very, very different to the military experience. So far from wellbeing being sort of uniform at one particular site, we can have an environment where the military love it and the civilians really don't like it, and vice versa. So there's a complexity there that would be lost if we tried averaging all that information out and then just looking at it, you know, from an organizational average point of view. It is that detail, that sort of high resolution, that enables us to precisely understand what the challenges are in specific workplaces. So that longitudinal measurement has, you know, really sort of brought a huge benefit in terms of understanding what we need to do and where, and given the finite resources that we have, where we would be best spending money to try and make an intervention. In terms of the non-longitudinal stuff, so this is actually looking at the impact of evaluations. We don't do it to anything like the degree of sophistication that, you know, Kevin, Sarah, and Helen do. But what we do try and do is borrow some of their evaluation techniques. So, for instance, when the College for Policing mindfulness trial was going on, we did our own one in defence intelligence, but we borrowed the UEA evaluation framework, which helped us understand the impact that we were having. So I think at the very simplest level within our organisation, the framework we use to try and encourage healthy behaviours at the individual level is the 5 Ways to Wellbeing framework, which I think most of you should be familiar with. The reason we do that is that if any of our staff go to a GP, you know, to seek support for a mental health issue, like or not, that is the resource that they're going to be directed towards. So it made sense to us to use the same framework within our organisation as, you know, as staff might be directed to within a GP. And as a rough yardstick, we've actually found it quite useful. So if you're not familiar with the 5 Ways to Wellbeing, you know, it's 5 behaviours where there's a reasonable evidence base to suggest that if you incorporate them into your daily routine, they will have a wellbeing benefit. So giving you an example, you know, there are some activities which, you know, have discrete benefits. So, you know, the 5 ways of connection, so stay connected, stay active, keep learning, take notice, and give. Giving an example, Claire, one of my colleagues who's been, you know, a real star in terms of developing our mindfulness effort within the organisation. She used to encourage people to leave our, you know, one of our facilities. There are no windows in it. It's a difficult working environment if you're there over a long period of time. So what she tried to do was encourage people to leave that building at lunchtime, get out, sit down, do a little bit of mindfulness practice. We called them mindfulness taster sessions. And what we found was that there were actually multiple benefits if you actually sort of consider that 5 Ways to Wellbeing as a little bit of a checklist. So these staff were coming out and they were learning a new skill. They were learning mindfulness, which helped them to take notice. They were also making new social connections, perhaps interacting with people in the building that they didn't know. So there were new friendships forming as a result of that. Some people were sitting down and eating their lunch together afterwards. Other people were going out and having a walk around the RAF base and sort of taking notice, getting a little bit of exercise. And Claire herself was giving her time to actually help others within her community. So even just a very simple assessment like that, you know, using the 5 Ways to Wellbeing as a framework, has actually sort of helped us to sort of assess, you know, the sort of benefits we might hope to get. On the mindfulness side, we did a smaller scale trial before we launched our pan-organisational mindfulness offer. And we got some really fantastic results out of it. We've got between 15 and 20% of the organisation meditating on a regular basis now. The weekly reports I get from Headspace give me an idea of the packs that people are trying to access. So if people are looking for support with sleep or winding down, I can actually sort of see that, and then that gives me an indication for the sort of support services that might actually resonate best within workplaces. We got some really good evaluation results in terms of staff life satisfaction, and we got double-digit increases for that. So staff the participating staff really liked it, and we used the evidence that we got from that to inform the business case to expand it across our business unit, and that's subsequently been done over the rest of Strategic Command, which is another 25,000 people. So starting small with that evaluation process is enabled us to demonstrate that what we're doing is effective, and has informed the business case to seek funding so we can expand it wider within the organisation. I think the final thing I wanted to touch on was mental health first aid training, because it is expensive if you look at it on a per head basis, and it costs around about £300 for a 2-day course. But we found that training up our own instructors helped us get costs down from about £300 a head to around £20–25, which was just the cost of training materials. And one of Kevin's PhD students helped us with the cost effectiveness work on that. And although, I think the long-term impact of sort of mental health first aid and a lot of other workplace interventions is actually yet to be, fully determined, what there is good evidence about is that, it helps raise awareness of mental health conditions, and it also improves the confidence of people to talk about mental health, as Sarah was discussing a little bit earlier on. So when one looks at, the core recommendations, say, of the Farmer-Stevenson review, that is that is a third of the Farmer-Stevenson core recommendations partially addressed by that mental health first aid program, building up awareness of mental health conditions, destigmatizing conversations about it, and just making people feel easier talking about mental health. And so I think the final benefit that we've gotten is more of an intangible, and that is that sort of community factor where people do the mental health first aid training, and then find that they're actually able to help their colleagues within their working environment with listening and signposting support. So when you actually go back to the 5 Ways to Wellbeing framework, this is another good example of people giving their time and demonstrating pro-social behaviours to actually sort of enhance the sort of the positive culture within their community. So even if you're actually sort of adopting a sort of perhaps a lower grade sort of evaluation framework, that there are things that you can do to actually sort of measure whether or not there is some sort of indicative effect of the interventions that you're making in workplaces. And one of the beauties I've actually found of working with the academic community is they're hungry for our data, we're hungry for their knowledge and experience. And so there's been numerous occasions now where working with UEA and King's has really brought my organisation huge benefit, because they're able to analyse data that we would not have the skill sets or the resources to do otherwise. And so I would encourage you, if you are an employer and you want to move into this sort of evaluation space so you can learn what works and what doesn't, do reach out to the academic community, because they've been absolutely invaluable to us. And then finally, I think, just sort of rounding it off before questions, I think, building back from COVID, there's a number of areas where, I think focus is required. The first thing is actually understanding what your workforce needs. So if you're following the Farmer-Stevenson recommendations and routinely monitoring employee wellbeing and mental health, then if you can actually identify the particular challenges that you've got in your workplace, and don't assume they're going to be the same across your whole organisation, particularly if it's widely dispersed. If you can actually get that high resolution detail, even if it's through focus groups in organisations, to actually understand what the issues affecting staff are, then it means that you can be much more adept at making interventions which are going to have an effect that has a perceptible impact on staff. You're not blindly selecting an intervention and hoping it's going to have some sort of impact somewhere along the line. You're channeling your resources to where they're needed most. And I think, longitudinal measurement, yes, that's important, but certainly monitoring the interventions that you make. And again, it doesn't need to be randomized controlled trials. It's great if you can, because that'll add to the evidence base. But there are sort of, simpler things that you can do. So that simple 5 ways to wellbeing yardstick, I think, is quite an effective one if you don't have a great deal of money. I think if you do have sort of more resources, then, do try to be a little bit ambitious and then share your results. That evidence base, if we can actually improve it at the national level, will benefit all of us. And so, any workplace evaluation that seeks to measure, wellbeing effects is going to add to that evidence base and help us all get our workplaces, put our workplaces on a more positive footing. And then I think finally, just using wellbeing as a key metric, if you're going to do staff surveys, I know the Civil Service People Survey, which is running at the moment, it's got room for a number of wellbeing questions, including the 4 subjective wellbeing questions that we use. But if you are actually doing staff surveys, you can get these question sets very, very easily online. And even if you're just measuring life satisfaction and job satisfaction every 6 months or so, it at least gives you an indicator whether you're moving in a positive or a negative direction. So there is a scalable approach here, and I think if you have the resources, then I think you will see huge benefits measuring well-being. If you don't have the resources, then there's still stuff you can do to measure the impact that you're having. So I'll stop there, and Mike, shall I hand back to you if anyone wants to field questions?
Great. Wow. Well, firstly, thank you very, very much both to Sarah and Martin. I thought that was fascinating. Really, both aspects of the presentations were really, really good. One thing I forgot to mention at the very beginning was that if any of the audience have questions, please do use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask those. I can see there's a few questions here that I'll dive to straight away. I've got lots of questions of my own, but I'll leave it to the audience to kick us off. So I think a few simple questions to begin with. So these slides, will they be made available to the audience? I guess, Martin?
Yeah, I'm more than happy to. So I'll share them with you, Mike, and please do feel free to distribute them.
Magic.
Sarah, you're happy with that as well? Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Great. I think maybe linked to that, there was a question about, I think from Sarah's presentation, about the case studies and whether they're published anywhere. I saw one reference, maybe others, but perhaps you can say something there.
Thank you. Yes. Well, the some of our case study evidence is already available through that set of resources that Marion put the link to on the What Works Centre for Wellbeing. And so those resources there are partly about the organizational context, how you go about implementing a well-being strategy, but also detailing case studies, those case study examples. And Kevin and I and co-authors have a chapter that will be coming out I think later this year, so just in time for Christmas. Yeah, so those will be available in the interim. If anyone has any particular questions about those case studies, do feel free to email me, and I'll do my best to answer those. Thank you.
Fantastic. Then a couple more questions from Teresa in the audience. So, do you capture information on impact on your wellbeing communications or promotions activity? I guess maybe that's more towards Martin. Does that make sense, that question? Oh, and you're on mute, I'm afraid, Martin.
So I've done it again. Yeah, we share all the findings with staff, and so yeah, I mean the recent report that we've put out, which actually looks at what's changed between 2018 and 2021. Yeah, yes, we share that with staff. I think when you actually look at the findings and just how important local issues are, we see such diversity that what we're trying to do is actually at the centre we measure, monitor and advise, but I think the action has to be taken at community level, because it's really up to leaders to establish to establish positive microcultures within the organisation. And I think you can't compare a group of civilian analysts looking at producing military maps and then compare them to perhaps signals intelligence military analysts. They do completely different roles. They work in different environments, and so I think there's a huge importance of leaders and local networks owning activity at the community level, but acting on the data that we provide centrally. So yeah, we always try to share that, and the heat map approach that we use enables leaders to sort of visually identify areas where they do have sort of challenge, perhaps it might be relationships, it might be facilities, it might be whether staff have got the right tools and systems to do their job. It might be physical or mental health provision, but we do require local communities to act on that and to own it.
Brilliant. Can I say something about that communications dimension? Because one of the things we've been looking at using secondary data is how many employees within an organisation are aware of the wellbeing provision, and then how many use it. And it's quite clear that awareness is highly variable, and that you may see greater benefits if more people were aware, but and of course used these interventions. But actually, we get distinct positive benefits in organizations where people know that this provision is available but don't use it. So it actually makes people feel valued by their employers, even if they don't actually need the stop smoking program or the weight loss program. They feel that that's actually an organization that cares about the health and well-being of its staff.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So then a couple more questions about, I guess, maybe measurement of well-being. So I think that there's a specific question about, do you use HSE stress management tools in your work? And then I think just first principles, I think there's a lot of interest in just how do you actually measure well-being? What do you the nuts and bolts of actually how you go about doing that, perhaps linked to surveys or pulse surveys.
Can you see the slide I put up on my screen, Mike?
Yeah, I can.
So this is the framework that we use. So this is the What Works Centre for Wellbeing 5 Drivers model. So you can access it on their website. So I noticed there was a question about the HSE stress sort of tool. So when this model was put together a few years back, and Kevin was on the expert review panel for it, what we did at the What Works Centre was we did an evaluation of just about every model we could find on workplace wellbeing. So we looked at the PERMA frame, Marty Seligman's sort of PERMA framework. We looked at the HSE stress tool. We looked at the well-building standards. We worked with the Money Advice Service and the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute to look at their financial capability frameworks. So what we ended up doing was cobbling together a model, and this is the model that we came up with for the Department for Work and Pensions, which actually looked at all the factors that we understood at the time that had a bearing on well-being in the workplace. So they're all clustered under 5 drivers, and I won't go through all the detail, but you will be able to pick up aspects of positive psychology there. You'll see sort of elements of the Warwick Edinburgh shorter WEMWEB scale as well. So this is, what we think is a model of the different sort of things within workplace that influence well-being as an outcome. So if you think, you feel happy or you feel sort of satisfied with your life based on your assessment of how your life is going at home and at work, these are the workplace sort of issues that we've identified. So this is what we measure within defence intelligence, and there's two variants of the tool. You can either sort of go through and ask questions about all these dimensions, or there's a shorter snapshot tool, as it's called, which actually just asks 2 or 3 questions associated with each of those 5 main drivers, and your selection really depends on the resources you've got available. The full survey does take quite a lot of analytical resource to use, the snapshot survey a bit less so, but all these are available on the What Works Centre for Wellbeing website.
Thank you, Martin. Hopefully that's answered your question. I think, particularly it's important to emphasise that with few resources, if you're expecting people don't have a lot of time to fill out long surveys, then these shorter surveys are really invaluable at providing kind of quick and simple insights into levels of well-being, issues that are particularly important for people's well-being, and things like that. Please do carry on with your questions. We've still got 10 minutes left of the webinar. I will shortly invite Kevin to join in and perhaps ask some questions if he has them. I have one question perhaps. I thought it was really interesting, Sarah, the findings. Often the outcomes of these interventions, these wellbeing interventions, can be quite unexpected. So, I guess, commonly you'd think investing in a wellbeing intervention, you wouldn't then expect, the number of people kind of looking for more substantial mental health treatment to increase, but it makes perfect sense when you think about it. So I think I was pleased to see that and an acknowledgement that these findings are out there. I guess my question is, do you imagine that there are kind of ceiling effects with these interventions? With the intervention and the amount of money spent, is there really a bump we're seeing with well-being that would then level off, or is there really maybe it's a difficult question to answer, an unlimited capacity or potential to improve people's well-being?
Right, that is a big and difficult question to answer. What I'm looking at the moment is whether or not we see differential effects of wellbeing interventions. So do we see, for instance, those people who already have a higher level of wellbeing being the group that actually engage? If we compare those people with high and low well-being, do we see bigger gains or smaller gains? So what we're certainly seeing is that those people with lower levels of well-being do get bigger, greater benefits from engaging in the wellbeing provisions within their organisations. And of course, those who have poorer productivity or health conditions, we get bigger productivity benefits for those employees. So I think certainly that suggests that it's not a sort of an ever increasing continuum, but that there probably are different elements that we haven't quite bottomed out yet. So I think that getting mental health support within the workplace right, I think that there's still some way to go on that, because the evidence we're seeing in organizations is this mixed picture of, yes, maybe some increased confidence, yes, maybe less burnout and less turnover, but also more days. So we're actually thinking of perhaps better ways to support employees rather than than what we've got at the moment.
Sorry. So a few more questions from the audience, which will make much more sense than my question. So one question, a couple of questions relate to resistance to ideas for investing in well-being. So I guess leadership resisting the idea of this being an important issue, and whether there are subcultures across organizational units where these ideas are taken on with some units, but not by others. So we'll maybe start there, maybe to Martin.
Yeah, I mean, we've got an interesting demographic, and I think we should probably share it, with the likes of the police and other elements of the emergency service. We have staff who we ask to do some pretty challenging things. We send them to some quite unpleasant places, and certainly within my organisation, we have civilian analysts who have to wade through some very toxic material. So I think we have a very unique demographic. I mean, I think it's shared, perhaps with, other organizations, or other professions who do need to sort of, face some fairly challenging environments. So I think social workers may come into it as well. And we're actually working with the UAE at the moment and the What Works Centre for Children's Social Care, to actually, look, evaluate a particular intervention there. I think the big challenge with certainly in my organisation with getting it going was actually just breaking away from this idea that well-being is a sort of fluffy nice to have, and so we put a lot of effort in actually helping leaders understand the hard business benefits. And when you're in an organisation like intelligence, we're constantly having to respond to evolving threats, crises that sort of spring up at very, very short notice. So we want staff who, are creative or innovative, who can learn very, very quickly, can adapt to change, and actually help us deal with that sort of rapidly changing environment. And once, I think we had our senior leadership sort of convinced that, there were benefits in terms of organisational output investing in wellbeing, I think the sort of journey became a lot easier as a result of that. But I just think we're still dealing with a sort of legacy where, a lot of people seem to think wellbeing is about going to the gym occasionally and eating the odd salad. But, when you actually look at it, certainly in a holistic sense that we do, it's almost a connective tissue that binds organizational culture together. It's good management practices, it's good facilities management, it's good IT provision, it's making sure that job quality sort of issues are considered. It's setting people clear objectives and providing them with regular review throughout the year. So I think once you actually start to acknowledge that well-being can be this sort of holistic mechanism binding multiple sort of organizational activity together, I think that's when you get that sort of almost that penny drop moment in leadership, and they can actually see just how beneficial it can actually be. I mean, ultimately, I think from a cultural sense, it's always nice to sort of work in an organization that thinks treating staff well is the decent thing to do. And I think you're always going to get benefit from that. But even if you're sort of hard-nosed and you're only investing it for business benefit, I think there's clear utility in doing that as well. And as the evidence base continues to build, I think this sort of pressure to actually, look at well-being in a more robust and holistic way within workplaces is probably going to increase. So, sorry, a bit long-winded, but I think that business benefit thing I found particularly sort of important within my leadership, because when that happened, things started moving.
Yeah, and just to add to that, in our case study work, where we've been following organisations through their well-being journey from implementing through to sort of delivery, we've been looking at organisations of different size and at different points in their well-being journey, and certainly leadership is important. Middle management training, support, and buy-in is absolutely crucial. And because this case study fieldwork was conducted during COVID, it probably came through more strongly. But authenticity of the offer is also important. People have got to believe that this is actually, something that the senior management care about, and that's why they're doing it, not some sort of box ticking exercise.
I'd absolutely endorse that, Mike. That leadership authenticity is critical. Staff aren't stupid. You know, if you're rolling out a few interventions just to say you're doing well-being, you know, that'll be transparent. So meaning what you're doing, you know, doing it for the right reasons, that authenticity, I absolutely agree with that.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think we're nearly out of time. I did say I'd invite Kevin onto the call. I haven't done that yet, but Kevin, if you want to join us, at least, on video, and you can say the final words if you wish, Kevin.
Well, thank you to everyone. Thanks to Mike for chairing so brilliantly again, and for Sarah and Martin, who are reliably good. It has to be said. But there is one person I always like to thank. It was easy, but it's now Marion, who's behind there, has coordinated all of this and made sure all the tech works. So without Marion, we'd be sat talking to blank screens. So she deserves as much as a round of applause as our two speakers do, and you do as well. And the last thing to say is, while we're organising our last panel session, we don't quite have a date yet, do we, Mike? It'll be later in November. We'll have all the speakers in series, hopefully, together to discuss their reflections on the challenges to wellbeing over the past sort of 18 months, almost 2 years now.
Yeah, thanks. So hopefully 25th of November, we will confirm that. Thanks for all the questions in the chat. We will answer those that we haven't got to by typing answers and things like that. But yeah, thank you, everyone. And we'll say goodbye for now.